So actually the topic of today is, around PII, sensitive data. So overall first is, what is PII? So there are lots of debates around, is it PI, PII, PIA, etc. So we're just going to talk and specifically talk about PII today and sensitive information. So overall, what PII is, it's just some information that will allow to identify, a person, whether it's, a first name and last name, and obviously you know who this is. So if you know Bruno Masick, obviously you know it's me. But in some cases, if you've got, let's say, the first name of a person and you've got a zip code, well, these are traces, but at the end, with that information, you're able actually, or you've got a chance to find who's behind. So you're able to combine this information. And for each of these definitions, I tried to put a source, so you'll see that on the bottom. And then additionally, we'll be sharing all the sources at the end of the webinar, so there's a specific slide around that. There are quite a few examples of PII based on NIST that we're going to go through. So of course, you've got a name. Here it can be Funzy or Keith Johnson or Bruno Masick, whatever. So that's basically what a name is. Phone number, of course, you know that. I don't know if you want to share that, Keith, today, but all over the place. Of course, you've got the address, you've got the password, the passport, emails, credit card, all the financial information. Biometric information is something important, even religion. So these are common examples of PII that you need to be looking into. And there's a lot of information that's NIST publication, the 800-122 that's listed below. In terms of categorizing the PII, so overall, not all the PII have got the same importance. Some PII, they've got, you can classify them with a low impact level. Some, are moderate, some are very high. So that really depends of, every organization and the type of information that you're dealing with. For example, if you're, let's say, within the IRS, as example, some information around your taxes, of course, will be very sensitive. So I would say that this is rather high. In terms of categorizing the PII by impact level, so there are 6 ways to basically determine the impact level, because each time is you need to determine, okay, what's the impact of having that type of PII content within your environment. So you've got the first one, identifiability. The second one is quantity of PII. The third one is data field, sensitivity, context of use, obligation to protect the confidentiality, and then access and location of PII. The first one is, for example, is if you've got a social security number, it's very easy, obviously, your zip code, just to find someone, so to identify someone, it's very, very easy to do it. So that's what it corresponds to. Then the second thing is, it's very important in your environments to determine, okay, what quantity of PII do I have in my environment? So you really need to list that, understand that. And it's because, of course, depending of which agency you're with, you might have more or less PII, and regardless, is you need to quantify that and classify that. Obviously, then, the data field sensitivity. So, of course, some data fields are more or less sensitive than some others. And what you specifically here need to be cautious with is, let's say, if you're associating some data fields together, they can become more sensitive. So let's say you've got Bruno and you've got Masick, okay, separately. So my first name and last name. So separately, maybe they're not as sensitive, but if they're together, they're a lot more sensitive. Or again, is if you put my last name and my zip code, these fields together, will become very sensitive because obviously you can very, very easily find out who's behind. Of course, you've got the context of use. So depending of what you're doing or, which agency you're with and the type of content you have is, some information might be more or less, sensitive. Of course, you've got, which I mentioned before, is you've got the obligations to protect the confidentiality. So of course, you need to make sure that you understand what PII you've got, and then you understand what are your obligations. And specifically, there's some type of PII that are more sensitive than others. So just be careful with that. And then of course, then the last one is you've got the access to and location of PII. So realistically is if you've got some PII, you need to trace basically, how often people are having access to that information. So obviously the more often you've got access to this information, the higher risk. And of course you need to look even where people are having access to that type of information. So, so these are the 6, biggest categories, based on NIST and 800-122 publication. So here, we were talking with Keith around metadata, PI, and sensitive data. So why did we do this slide? So often we heard over the years people saying, you know what, metadata is not PII, it's not sensitive or anything. Well, actually, you're wrong. Metadata is can be very, very sensitive. So of course you've got, the first thing that you think about is the IP or MAC address. Okay, yeah, that's, for good reasons, that contains PI information. And it contains PI information about the people that are actually consuming, for example, your analytics. In general, metadata is not going to tell you just, metadata by definition is just a piece of information. Okay, so it's in general, it's just a trace, but the reality is with AI, big data, you're able to use these traces. So the metadata that, it's just a trace in general, you're able to assemble all these information together and you're able to find who's behind it. So in the past, it was not that big of a deal, but over time, you have so much big data capabilities. You've got AI now that is able to combine, such a large amount of information. It's, metadata is becoming very, very sensitive. And the reality is metadata is very easy to consume from a big data from an AI perspective. And as a result, it's very, very easy to assemble that information and trace it back to someone. And additionally, one other thing that people tend to forget is the auditing metadata that you have. For example, in BusinessObjects, it's if you couple that to the rest of the metadata that you have, it makes the PI content and its importance a lot easier to find, because obviously if you see this field or that field is more used than another, and by a certain type of users, is very easy to understand, well, that content, has got a high access and maybe it's got a high value. So just make sure that you don't forget about that. What is BI critical for PI and sensitive content? So over the years, we've been hearing, you know what, Bruno, Keith, Bob J, BusinessObjects, or our analytics solutions in general, there's no issue for SOX, for FISMA, or for personal information, because these are just analytics. We just control everything at the database level. Well, that's all wrong, because the reality is it doesn't matter. The thing that matters is where you're going to share the information. and you're going to share the information from your BI solution. That's why you've got a BI solution, is it's to share information, because the BI solution, in fact, is going to centralize all the information that you have and is going to share it to all its consumers, whether they're governed or not governed. And analytics in general is very complex, as you know, because you got ETLs, and then it's going to compile some bunch of data, assemble it, mix it, and then bring it in a dashboard or report. So you need to be very, very careful with the information that you've got with your analytics, and also how it's shared, and in particular if that content is shared outside your business objects. So yes, business objects is, and your analytics is very, very critical for that. So just don't forget, it's not only your database. In fact, in my opinion, this is far more sensitive. The chance with business object is you've got, for people who leverage universes, it's a very good way to keep your information safe. Here, and we'll go back to this chart after. Maybe Keith, you want to say a couple words on that chart around PII there, or?
Yeah, sure. So this sort of gives us our kind of classic example of where business objects sort of resides in terms of the overall solution, right? So business objects really becomes the hub of data flowing from our enterprise data warehouse, maybe pushing out via scheduling or bursting out to a variety of formats. And then we've got our consumers, right? Either via PC or a smartphone, laptop. They're consuming crystal reports, Webby documents, all of that. We still have sort of control over. And then you get into the point where, okay, they have those documents, whether they pushed it out or printed it out as a PDF or Excel documents. As soon as that sort of resides or leaves that kind of business objects domain, then that really falls into that disconnected or ungoverned data that you've got to be really concerned about, or at least sensitive in terms of what data is really going down that path, right? Because you've sort of lost control over that, right? So we'll talk to that specifically when we get into the 6 steps. Bruno, anything you want to add to that I missed?
No, I think we'll cover it more in detail after. No, that's great. And by the way, that schema here is you can use it actually for any BI solution, by the way. So it's just not exclusive only to Bobjet here. So we've got a first poll that we put together is, tell us really how you handle your PII today. So we've tried to explain at a high level what PII was, or what sensitive content was, and basically, we're interested to know, well, how do you guys handle your PII? We follow a process to handle PII. We handle case by case, no specific handling. We don't have PII. Not sure where to start. So, it's always interesting to talk with people about how they handle that, and because every agency is a little bit different, and it's always interesting to hear on that. So we're going to close the poll in another 5 seconds. So please take your time. I think like 60%, 80% now of the people have voted. So let's close the poll. So in terms of results for the poll, so 69% of people, fortunately, have got they've got a flow actually on how to process and handle the PII. 15%, handle it case by case, and then another 15%, don't have any specific hung. Thank you very much. So, Keith?
I think, Bruno, the one thing to take away from that was sort of interesting was at least people recognize that PII means a lot of different things to people, because one of the options was we don't have PII, and nobody responded to that. So at least a couple years ago when we were talking about this, or 5 years ago when we were talking about this, I think you would have seen some more numbers in there. And now that, because data security, PII is more, I'll call it maybe more commonplace, that people are more sensitive to that within their organizations. So that's good to see.
Yeah, and you get training as well around PI. I think, or, is not as common before, but now I think pretty much everyone gets training around that, fortunately. So,
Yep. For those of you that are, work with the federal government or in the federal government, that is a yearly required training, right? There's always something in regards to PII, and how it's handled specifically for your agency, et cetera.
so Keith, tell us. So we put together this process around 6 steps on how to handle your PI and sensitive content. So I'll pass it over to you for the step number 1.
Sounds good. Thanks, Bruno. So the first thing is, how do we determine or find that PII information within our organization? So first off, getting input from the GRC team, so the governance, risk, and compliance folks, access to external data catalogs, interfacing and exchanging with our business or agency. By experience, the business users tend to have the best understanding of what really contains PII, right? They really understand the data more so, and how it's utilized, right? And in addition, maybe need to be educated to classify that information by their GRC team, right? So understanding how to start classifying PI information is to understand the sort of the following topics. One is direct identifier, so information that can really directly identify an individual, right? So that's and Bruno, you touched on this earlier. So that goes back to name, address, social security number, IP, those kind of things that we all have started to realize. And then the second group, which is sort of the quasi identifiers, information that could be aggregated to identify somebody, right? So in and by themselves may not necessarily be directly identifying, but once you aggregate that information up. So as Bruno, I think you used your first name, your last name, and maybe Boston on your baseball cap, and those multiple identifiers that can be aggregated to really start to count, or count towards direct identification of somebody. All right. For step 2, this is where we get in and tag and catalog the data. So really in business objects today, you have 2 levels of granularity that can be leveraged. One is document level, your Crystal, Webby reports, and then at an object level. And really object level is preferable, right? Because that's really at the granular level at each individual element, right? So whether it's first name or last name, social security number, trying to think what else, telephone number, all those individual elements can be tagged. In the event that you're not utilizing Universe, then you have to sort of go back to the document level, which isn't a bad thing. It's going to be a little bit higher. It's not going to be as low a level of granularity as within a Universe. It's also important to keep that proper nomenclature of the information to classify it's based on in its impact level, right? Is it sensitive? Is it extremely sensitive? Is it identifiable information? And really, again, this sort of goes back to our previous step. You really need to work with the business to really determine that level of information. Some of it might be, obvious, social security number, that kind of stuff, but there may be other elements in there that where you need to lean on the business to really define that level. And then lastly, when tagging the information, we also need to understand the life cycle for that information, right? So, data that's, within the last 6 months, 12 months, and then at what point does it really not, or does it become less important? And maybe eventually it gets archived or deleted from the system. Now that doesn't mean it necessarily disappears, and we'll touch on that towards the end on step 6. But that data is then archived off onto a removable media device or some other mechanism, which can always be accessed in the future, but no longer sort of sits into the I'll call it the hot data that's utilized on a daily basis. All right.
And in terms of nomenclature, it's really critical to keep something clean there, because you're going to keep your analytics for many, many years. And it's so often, I think, that we see deployments where there was a guy who started, he left the organization, and then he started to put this nomenclature in place, and then somebody comes up and then he decides to change everything, but he forgot that there was content that was created, and at the end you've got different nomenclators and it's not organized, and at the end is, even if there was the will to get things straightened out, it's just there's no common nomenclature, so that's always it's always a common issue.
Yeah, I mean, and when we started to get into this stuff, I know, like, when we come to technical folks, our documentation is sometimes wanting. I will leave it at that. But when you when you really get into this stuff, documentation is really key to one, understand what we're tracking, how we're tracking it, the standards we're using, because it is important. Because again, if something is exposed, and that goes back to the news on it always almost seems like maybe not a daily basis, but a weekly basis, where you're hearing about organizations or businesses where there's data breaches or security, and it may be, some of it may be planned, some of it may be just accidental, but it's very important that we try to we track this information.
And in business objects.
So this is an example of IDT, or the design tool, the information design tool for the UNX universes. So just looking through here, we would tend to tag or add tags to the description. So for example, for username, where it has login, name of user, we would add a identifiable tag to track whether or what level of information that is, whether it's sensitive or identifiable, something like that. And here's a great example of the 360 universe tool, where we can take those universes, we can export it out to Excel, we can update those object descriptions. So if you see in column F, the # sensitive data GDPR _ personal, those are examples of tracking tags. And then we can import that back into the universe, and that will be updated. Those descriptions will be updated back in the universe itself. Now, I know for us, from using GB and Smith, we'll usually, instead of the technical folks filling out those descriptions or tweaking those descriptions, we'll either work with a business user or even provide the business user with the Excel document, because one, will also take advantage of just updating the regular description, as well as they maybe have again, they probably will have a better handle on the sensitivity. What we may do is provide them the tags, but allow them to actually do the updating, and then we'll take care of importing it back in the universe to make it available. Excuse me. Step 3, documenting, reporting, and monitoring. So this is sort of we start to get into a little bit of I'll call it the care and feeding process, where we're reporting and monitoring on that PII and the sensitive information. But while we're doing that, we also require access to the following BobJ components. So that includes the CMS, right? So the CMS has all the metadata in our system. The auditor database, right? That that will track who is touching what, when, and how. And then obviously the file store that has all of our documents and instances, right? So that has both the report objects themselves and even save data in some, in the case of instances. Also during this is we want to ensure that we've documented our data lineage, understand the different data source connections, and how the ETL plays its sort of part in here. So if you're leveraging data services or information steward, those are all the other tools as part of this that sort of come into play when trying to track that lineage through the solution. Okay. And then, I know we've talked about this in the past, BI on BI, right? So being able to do business intelligence on your BI system, making use of all that data from Auditor and from your CMS, along with a data lineage, pulling all that stuff together is super important. All right. And then besides tracking the PII information in your analytics solution, we also want to make sure that you're tracking the actual activity, right? So what is actually occurring on that data? Are people scheduling it out to their email? Are they, how often are they viewing it? Who actually has access to the data, right? How are they, or who's viewing it? Is it, do we have some kind of HR report and somehow Bob from sales has access to it? Well, that's a big no-no, right? So really understanding who has access to that information. All right. So this is an example of a report utilizing or via 360 Eyes to show that the tags that we've uploaded or we uploaded back to the universe and be able to see those different objects across the universe. So this is just a little bit different kind of view, but it's really doing the BI on BI reporting, right, Bruno?
Yep, that's correct. Exactly. And you're able to report on all these tags on, where they are, if they're used, not used, and document that. And then in addition here, we put together maybe 2 years ago a document, actually at a past federal user group, an article around account and user account verification. And that was, we'll put a link at the end and on how to understand that process. Because still a lot of people today we see don't necessarily have a full visibility around that type of verification. So you want to make sure that if people, they have access, but they haven't used a specific content, well, just, remove them the access. So that article is talking around that as well. How do you handle with your backups? For example, if you got a DR situation, you roll back, let's say 5 days ago or 2 days ago, well, the people that you've removed, the sensitive information that you've removed is, 2 days ago is back. So how do you handle that? All these little things that you should think about are actually covered in that article. Step number 4, Keith.
Yeah. So one other thing and it sort of ties in with this is really if you're in a federal organization or doing work for a federal organization as a business objects administrator or administrator of a BI system, you should be familiar with that yearly account recertification. If you're not, I would ask somebody, because at some point that should be being done, right? That is and I'll say maybe 5 years ago it wasn't as prevalent, but nowadays that is definitely a yearly activity for tracking, and that feeds directly back to the security group within the organization. So if you're not doing it, I would definitely double check this one and make sure you reach out to your boss or your security group as to the needs for this for your organization. So really sort of going back to the sort of the details behind this is is really understanding or analyzing the permissions users have to access the content, and then also determine who really needs access to it, right? It's not just that you have access, is do the right people have access? Or do the wrong people have access, and that needs to be addressed, right? So understanding, understanding and documenting that security and the inheritance, comparing that security as it adjusts over time, right? People come, they go, people change jobs, so security is not just a, it's not just a one and done kind of thing. It evolves over time, right? Something that may have been open to, our user base may suddenly be deemed more secure, and we need to limit access to that, or vice versa. We need to be able to track actions and non-actions from users and documents and applications within the system, right? So what are people doing? How are documents changing, etc. Bruno, you sort of touched on this. Monitor decommissioned users and content. So being able to see what users have been removed from the system, what reports have been archived, manage quick removal of decommissioned users, so being able to archive off those users, and being able to provide proof that those users have been removed from the system, right? Security groups, when a user leaves an organization, we need to, confirm that yes, they no longer have access to the system. Their user has been physically removed or archived off. And then, in the case of providing a safe disaster and recovery solution with that decommissioned user. So, in a case where maybe sometime in the future we actually need to recover that user, having a plan for that. And then last but not least is really viewing the publication and bursting schedules, right? So this is one scenario where we may have one report that runs on a daily or weekly basis that goes out to 50 different offices or 50 different people within the organization. So really understanding that kind of impact, and then what data is really contained in those reports.
Yep.
Okay. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, sure. So overall, what that is over time, you've got some bunch of changes in your metadata, and of course, security is a metadata. So here, that's just a snapshot of 360 eyes that actually compiles historical information around changes in your security. So it's going to compare, for example, two pictures, of course, from two different times, and is going to highlight you the differences in security. And that type of documentation is absolutely necessary when you do some recertification, because you want to show how the security is and how it was over time. So it's very important to document that. And so often we see deployments that have got issues to document their security, because it's fairly complex to do. So it's a nice way to do that and to keep track of it over time. It's such a big work when you do all these recertifications to find out, well, what does Keith really have access to, and what does he really use? Well, maybe not much, I don't know, but it's always tricky.
So step 5, control content being shared. So this sort of goes back to our architecture diagram, sort of at the beginning, right, where we've got a couple of different scenarios. So the governed area is really where content is being shared within that BI platform. So our crystal reports, our Webby documents, where we feel like we've got some control and we've got security. And then scenario 2, which is sort of the governed data dump. I always love that, where we're starting to push data out, whether it's Excel files, or exporting that data from that system. And then the third one is that sort of ungoverned area, right, where that data has been pushed out to a spreadsheet or a PDF or a CSV file. We need to make sure that we hide or de-identify that PII information, right? because really once it hits those, I'll call it those standard formats, that's it, right? We no longer have control over it. The genie is sort of out of the bottle, as it were. So that's, that's where you start to get into the most risk on this stuff. So when we do get into that area, we really need to make sure that, any of the PII, we de-identify that information, right? So we either anonymize the user information. We either secure that file by a password, a watermark, encryption, or even tag the metadata, so like with a PDF metadata or Excel, a little tough to do on a CSV file, but within the metadata of those documents is really have tags in terms of, is there identifiable information within those documents? Bruno, anything you want to add to that?
No, no, I think that's pretty well covered. And actually, I think we've got a schema just to explain that. And by the way, just feel free to ask your questions in the chat box on the right. So no, I think that's pretty good. Let's go to the next slide.
And again, this is what we had touched on previously, which sort of covers those three areas, right? So the governed area within our business intelligence platform, the area where we touch on the governed data dumps, and then the ungoverned content, right? So the disconnected, even like a physical printout, right? Or a PDF or Excel document into the solution.
And really one key point there is, as long as what you're sharing stays within your BI environment, basically it's governed. So it's really, it's very manageable, obviously, because you've got a complete audit, you understand what's going on. But from the time it either goes out, so it's scheduled out of your BI environment, then it becomes very difficult to control, because you might be able to put a password or use encryption, but at the end is you're taking in sensitive information that you're moving out from your environment. And then one disease of analytics in general is a lot of people, well, Excel for good reasons, but unfortunately there is still probably the most popular BI tool on the market, whether we like it or not, Keith. I mean, you see people all the time using Excel, and the big issue there is the people there, they're actually, they're using, for example, Webby, and they're dumping that to Excel, and then they're doing their own little thing here and there, and eventually they're putting it to Tableau or wherever. And at the end, there is no traceability, whether you like it or not, of that. And even worse, there is no traceability, but as well as, you've got chances to have regression. So the data quality as well is not controlled anymore. So that becomes very, very tricky. So it's really, it's never a good practice to be doing that. And that's why we really wanted to bring that. So that's what it is for governed data dump, is you've got to govern, content that you're actually moving to Excel. Well, in that case, just make sure that you de-identify it. So just make sure you really do that. And there's an excellent paper from NIST specifically on that. It's like 50 or 60 pages. It's very interesting. It's going to explain you how to do that, by the way. So then Keith?
Yeah. So another kind of security feature we can leverage within the system is being able to password protect those instances, right? So whether it's PDF or an Excel or a zip file, so we can securely send the document and then send that password in a separate email. So even if someone does receive that document, they wouldn't necessarily be able to access it without that password as well. So at least putting some security measures in place if we are sharing that data.
Last step number 6, archiving and deleting, Keith.
Yep. So as we talked about at the beginning, is at the very end of the life cycle of data or content is we never want to just delete it. It does have some value. Maybe it diminishes over time, but understanding what that life cycle is. So how do we want to archive it? Even if we do delete it from the system, we always have some kind of backup archive in the future if we ever need to go back to it. And then the de-identification in some cases. So even if we're archiving that data, maybe we have to anonymize some of that data so it doesn't pose a security risk. Let's see. In terms of formats, I think we talked about, like the worm technology, and it's funny, I haven't heard that in a while, but the write once and read many, this is, the days of the CD or the DVD, right? You'd archive to the CD once and then close it, and then you could read it many times, but you wouldn't be able to ever go back and modify it. So another kind of security mechanism for archiving.
And then
And
that's
then,
just yeah, go ahead, Keith.
nope, yeah, I got it. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's just a way in 360 how to do some archiving, of your instances or how to delete them, and with all the different formats, and you're in general better off to keep them like PDF, Excel, or CSV or text, because it's easy to read them after. In terms of a takeaway, you want to cover that, Keith, as the last one?
Sure. So PII and sensitive content are not as daunting and are easy to deal with. Make sure you interface and exchange with your business or your business users. They will help you greatly in this task. Don't take it on alone. Understand the BI information flow. So really understand how data comes into your system, but how it flows out as well. It might surprise you. And then whatever decision you make sure you take it into consideration of that full life cycle, right? So origination of data coming in, and then when it does become no longer useful, how do we archive and actually remove it from the system? And then work on automating that life cycle management so it doesn't become an extra task for you to worry about, but it's handled more so by the system.
Thank you very much, Keith. And then just if you guys have got some interest to exchange with us around how to handle your PII, there's a short poll here. Just answer yes or no, and we're more than happy to exchange, Keith and I, with you around that topic. So it's something that we do on a regular basis, and we're more than happy to to go through it with our knowledge of BI on how to go through that. So we've got time maybe for 2 questions, Keith, by the time we close the poll. So, well, let me read you the first question. Is there a way to encrypt scheduled documents that contain PII information?
To encrypt, I know we can. So we can password protect documents. I'm trying to think if there is. I can't think of it. I don't know, Bruno. I can't think of a way from an encryption kind of perspective.
There are some tools that will do some of the encryption. Well, the reality is, first is if it stays within BobJ, it's encrypted.
Right.
By definition. The problem is, right, when you schedule things, yeah, there are ways to encrypt. The big issue with all these tools is, and actually we've considered doing it, but we didn't do it for a good reason, is these encryption standards are changing all the time, and it's very difficult to keep up. So overall, well, the good practice in reality is, keep it within BobJ. When you can't keep it within BobJ, just make sure that, your line is basically protected, and make sure that you actually provide, for example, leverage passwords. So yeah, there are ways to do it, but it's typically not a bulletproof system at all. And very often we've seen that passwords are an easier way to do it. Then there was another question, where do you password protect a document? Well, that's actually something that you can do in 360. I'm not aware that you can really do that in BobJ, Keith.
Yeah, we've always done it within CAST, and leveraged password protecting the zip files. But yeah, within BobJ, I don't think so. And I didn't, I was trying to think back to 4.3, if anything like that had been added, but nothing jumps to mind at the moment.
No, or it's something that we looked into and we haven't seen. The last one is how to deal with PII processing through ETL. You know, the thing is there, you've got your ETL that's going to, gather the information and push it to BobJ. And like, I'm not a specialist of ETL, but it's, the key there is how you're going to handle it in your analytics. I don't know if you got a last word on that before we go, but
I know within data services, it provides some of that kind of capability. If you're leveraging other, non-SAP ETL tools, then really you'd have to see how those individual tools would be able to transfer that kind of data lineage or that metadata.
And again, you can do a lot of things at the database level, but the reality is your analytics is going to be the portal through which you're going to share the information. It's critical to secure that. So, hey, Keith, we've been talking too long. It's time. We've got a session in 10 minutes with SAP around Discover the Power of HANA and the path to unlock it. So thank you very much for joining, and please take a couple seconds to answer the survey and use the same link after that to join the next session, the last one of the day. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, everyone.